J.R.R. Tolkien inspired and influenced thousands of fantasy authors. But who inspired the professor? Welcome to Mad on Books, where I talk about fantasy mostly, science fiction sometimes, and comics occasionally. I've mentioned it before. One of the first adult novels I can remember ever reading when I was 9 years old was Lord of the Rings. And for a long time, I had the vague idea in my head that Tolkien invented modern fantasy, or invented fantasy as a genre. I guess I always knew that that wasn't really exactly the case, but I'd never really looked into it. The earliest fantasy novel written that I have ever read was Lord of the Rings. And it occurred to me recently, that's kind of limited. I would like to know more. So I started looking around and I started asking some people. And of course, there was a lot of fantasy written before Tolkien wrote anything. You can call mythology fantasy, although it's not really like our current fantasy novels. But there's a lot of fantasy that we know that Tolkien read before he wrote Lord of the Rings. We know that there's a lot of fantasy novels that were written before, whether he read them or not. First of all, I want to say I am not an expert. I'm not an expert in the fantasy genre. I'm not an expert on Tolkien, and I'm not an expert on pre-Tolkien fantasy. I'm just looking into this myself, and while I was compiling a TBR for myself to read, I thought it'd be interesting to share. So, Tolkien published Lord of the Rings in 1954. He surely had read a lot of stuff before he wrote it. Because I'm not a Tolkien scholar, I don't know exactly what he read. There are some of these things I know for sure that he definitely did read. Some he may have not. Don't really know. Don't at me. And I also know that there are lots and lots of more fantasy novels that were written before Lord of the Rings. Feel free to tell me about them down in the comments. But again, don't at me. I'm not leaving things out on purpose. I'm just bumping into the things that I found and which were interesting to me, which I plan to read. I've organized these by year just because there's no other real way I could think of, and they're in no way organized by any kind of rating or anything like that, because most of them I haven't read. Only 2, I think, have I ever read before. So let's get started. In 1220 approximately, Snorri Sturluson probably wrote the Prose Edda. This is one I have read before. It's pretty short and easy to read. It's in very natural, modern feeling language, or at least this translation is, which is by Jesse L. Bayok. It's the source of pretty much all of, or most of, what we know about what we think of as Norse mythology. The stories of Odin and Thor and all of those guys. Loki, all sorts of things that have made it into the very mainstream pop culture consciousness of today, they originally come from here. If you've read anything else, any other retellings of Norse mythology, they also pretty much come from here. This is like the original source. I said probably and possibly. It's not sure, like with a lot of old books, exactly when this was written. It's also not exactly sure that Snorri Sturluson wrote it, or that he was the only author. Basically, what he was doing was collecting existing stories that up until that point had primarily existed in an oral tradition. So people were telling them and memorizing them and retelling them. And he was the first one, as far as we know, to collect all of these things and put them in a book so that we could read them many years later. It's really good. It's actually much more readable than you would expect of something written in the 13th century. And it's all of the stories that you've ever heard about the Norse gods, about Freya and Thor and Loki and the giants and the dwarves and all of that. We know certainly that it influenced Tolkien, because as you read it and you meet the dwarves, you'll realize that many of Tolkien's dwarves' names come straight out of that book. So definitely a pre-Tolkien fantasy, even though it's mythology. And definitely an influence on Tolkien. In 1485, approximately, Sir Thomas Malory, probably, wrote Le Morte d'Arthur, The Death of Arthur. Spoilers, he dies in the end. It's in the title. This is, again, basically a very similar thing to the Prose Edda in that Sir Thomas Malory, probably, again, historically, people are not sure exactly who he was or exactly when this was written, but he was collecting a bunch of stories, primarily that were already existing in French versions. He translated them, collected them, put them all together. It's the complete story of Arthur from the pulling of the sword from the stone, a bit before that, up until the end of his life. And it's I've read this 3 times. It's one of my favorite old books. I love this old knights and chivalry and pageantry. I love all of that stuff. I read a version of this when I was a kid. I own 3 versions of it. I just got this fancy leather-bound, gold-edged bookmark ribbon edition, and I'll be reading it again for sure sometime soon. It's written in a pretty old school kind of way. I'll give you an example from the very beginning. This is the very first paragraph. It befell in the days of Uther Pendragon, when he was king of all England and so reigned, that there was a mighty duke in Cornwall that held war against him long time. And the duke was called the Duke of Tintagel. And so by means Uther sent for his duke, charging him to bring his wife with him. For she was called a fair lady and a passing wise, and her name was Igraine. So it's a old kind of English, which takes a little time to get used to. It's not nearly as confusing as some old texts, but what most takes time to get used to is that it's kind of mythology, kind of a story. So there is the main story of Arthur becoming king and uniting England, and Lancelot getting with his wife, and all of these stories that we know. But there are also a ton of side stories where just some knight has some adventure, which a lot of those adventures are just collected because he was collecting, I think. They don't really have anything to do with the main story and what's happening and the flow of the plot. But they're all really, really interesting. There's a lot of fantasy elements with mythical monsters and Merlin and magic weapons and all of these cool things that we love from fantasy. I don't know for a fact that Tolkien read it, but I assume he did. It's a pretty big text in the canon of fantastical literature of the past. This one's on my list thanks to Philip Chase. I mentioned to him that I was doing this list, and he asked if I had Phantastes by George MacDonald on my list, and I did not. We know for certain that Tolkien read it. In some of his letters, I think, to other people, he comments on it and apparently didn't like it very much. But there are animated trees that move in this, and apparently they may have been an inspiration for the Ents in Lord of the Rings. Who knows? The story is first of all, it's a short one, pretty easy to read. It's a young man who gets pulled into the realm of fairy, and he spends most of the story chasing the Marble Lady, which sounds like she's like an animated statue, but she's sort of this maybe allegory or just metaphor for perfect beauty and perfect feminine qualities. And he encounters many strange things. From the summaries I've read, it sounds like it's a bit like Le Morte d'Arthur, in that it's a whole bunch of different episodes and not necessarily a really thought out sort of beginning to end plot kind of story. But I really don't know. I haven't read it yet. Horrible cover. But it's meant to be a big classic, and we definitely know that Tolkien read it. Another one that sounds like it's maybe somewhat inspired by Le Morte d'Arthur and similar stories of the time is The Well at the World's End by William Morris. It's the story of Ralph, maybe the most boring hero name ever in fantasy. Ralph is the fourth son of a minor king, and he's on a quest for the Well at the World's End. I don't know much more about it than that. It also sounds like it's a whole bunch of strange episodes going through fantastical dimensions or something. I haven't read it. I don't really know. I've only read a summary. Again, Philip Chase did, I believe, his thesis on William Morris. I'm not sure if it was specifically on this story or just William Morris in general, but it's almost certain. It sounds like it's certain. I don't personally know, but it sounds like it's certain that Tolkien read this, because there is a bad guy king in here named Gandalf, not Gandalf, Gandalf, O-L-F on the end, but still it's pretty close. And there's also a very special horse called Silverfax, which isn't so far from Shadowfax. So seems like a sure bet that Tolkien read this as well and was somewhat inspired by it, at least by the names. So getting into the 20th century, we have The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison. It sounds like a really strange story. I've heard from a number of people that it's really good. One of my friends says it's his favorite fantasy ever written. It starts off with a framing story where there's a character who travels from Earth to Mercury, to another planet. The place he lands in has nothing to do with Mercury, not even the 1922 conception of what Mercury was. And in the second chapter, that character who got our story to Mercury disappears completely and is never seen again in the story. It's an epic story of war between the Witchland and the Demonland, which have very little to do with witches or demons, apparently. There are numerous battles, betrayals, victories, and defeats. And it has sort of a theme of repetition from what I've heard. So the story at the end ends up where it was at the beginning, and the whole cycle of the story basically begins again. Tolkien definitely read it because he wrote a letter criticizing the silly character names in it. So there you go. Only a couple of years later, Lord Dunsany wrote The King of Elfland's Daughter. This is the story of Alveric, the son of the Lord of Earl. He travels to Elfland, sounds kind of like fairy, to win the hand of the king's daughter of the title. Lirizel is her name. And she marries him, but then returns to Earl with him. They have a son. She flees back to Elfland for some reason. He pursues her. The king of Elfland eventually absorbs the kingdom of Earl into Elfland. Apparently, it was extremely popular in its time. And what makes it stand out compared to a lot of the other ones is that it has these really gorgeous modern additions. Again, like most of these, not very big, but it's got this lovely copper foil on the cover. It's got an introduction written by Neil Gaiman. Sounds like a real classic, and I'm looking forward to reading it. Again, 2 years later, Hope Mirrlees wrote Lud in the Mist. Also not too big. Also a quite pretty edition. I don't know if you can see it, but it's got a debossed, this whole design on the cover is debossed into the cover. It also has an introduction by Neil Gaiman. So maybe having a modern, pretty edition of your book, the requirement is to have an introduction written by Neil Gaiman, maybe. This one sounds really different than what you would usually expect in a fantasy novel. The main character is the mayor of a town. His name is Nathaniel Chanticleer, and he is the mayor of the eponymous Lud in the Mist, which is a town that is bordering on our reality and fairy. And apparently they have a problem that fairy fruit, which has an effect on people, is being imported into their town. And I believe the mayor's son goes missing, and he has to go into fairy to reconcile our reality and theirs and get his son back, I think. Neil Gaiman called it one of the finest fantasy novels in the English language. It is a little golden miracle of a book. So, you've been told. Last but not least on my list, in 1946, Mervyn Peake wrote Gormenghast. Gormenghast is a bunch of different novels. Actually, only the first one came out in 1946. That is the one I have, which is Titus Groan. It's the story of the Groan family and the castle they live in, Gormenghast. There are 3 books and sort of a 4th one, if I understand correctly. It's more gothic than it is fantasy, like the real fantasy things that we kind of expect, like magic and mythical creatures and that kind of thing, doesn't seem to actually be in the book. It seems to be much more of a twisty, gothic, intriguey kind of thing about this castle and the people who live in it and the goings on there. But it definitely inspired lots of fantasy authors. I've seen it on a lot of authors' lists as far as what inspired them. And there's no knowing. I have no idea whether Tolkien read it, what he thought of it, whether it influenced him at all. But it sounds like a really interesting novel or trilogy. So that's my pre-Lord of the Rings fantasy TBR. I want to read these. I don't really have a schedule for it. I will read them when I get to them, which may not be this year even, because this year is pretty full. I've said it before, the internet is for telling people they're wrong and kittens. So please do feel free to tell me in the comments below of more that you know about these books, if you've read any of these books, and other really interesting fantasy books that may or may not have influenced but preceded J.R.R. Tolkien. I'd be interested to know. As always, thanks for watching. I hope you're well. And keep reading awesome books, even awesome early fantasy books. And I will see you next time.